Hi, my name is Kamil Zwolski. I am Associate Professor in International Politics in the Department of Politics and International Relations. I specialize in international relations and specifically European security governance, the role of NATO, the role of the European Union in international security, European-Russian relations and transatlantic relations. So those kinds of questions of geopolitics and global politics and global security and regional security, those are the things that I specialize in. I teach different modules in the department. I teach my optional module, European Security Governance, which means you can choose that module as an option, one of the options that you will have if you come to Southampton. In that module, we talk about questions of European security since the end of the Cold War. What I want to do here for this kind of short taster section is to give you a kind of flavor of the topics that we cover in that module and in some other modules. I want to talk about Europe-Russian relations, and this also kind of refers to a recent roundtable discussion in politics and international relations in PAIR in our department. We organize those regular roundtable discussions where we kind of invite external speakers and we talk about different topics. So recently I actually organized this kind of roundtable discussion, and we had experts from Russia and from the UK. So we had an expert from Russia who shared the kind of Russian perspective on the questions of European security. So kind of referring a little bit to that kind of roundtable that we had, I did my own presentation, so I'm going to share some of that with you now, and hopefully we will be able to talk much more about those issues at Southampton. So what I want to briefly kind of tell you about is the kind of problem of European-Russian relations. And if you follow the news, if you kind of read the news or watch the news, you will kind of know that the relations of the West, of Europe, NATO, or the European Union or the UK, kind of with Russia, have deteriorated, right? At the end of the Cold War, early in the 1990s, there was this kind of perception that now that the Cold War is over, there is now a chance to rebuild relations with Russia and perhaps to somehow integrate Russia into the kind of European system of kind of security and political order. Russia received a lot of assistance from the West, kind of technical, financial assistance, and perhaps Russia never received what it actually truly wanted, and that was either becoming a member of NATO and perhaps even the European Union at some point, or at least becoming much more closely associated with those organizations. And increasingly already in the 1990s, there was this kind of growing disappointment in Russia with how it felt it was treated by Europe and by the United States. And at that time, there was not that much that Russia could do with that disappointment. And NATO, after the Cold War, NATO is the North Atlantic Treaty Organization, which was created in the early days of the Cold War to counter the Soviet threat. Perhaps the expectation in Russia was that it should have disappeared at the end of the Cold War because its kind of purpose ceased to exist. But NATO didn't disappear, and not only that, it kind of reinvented itself for the post-Cold War period, and it kept expanding. It kept admitting new members, including the former Warsaw Pact members, the former kind of countries surrounding Russia and the Soviet Union. So Russia became increasingly anxious and uneasy about that development. Now, at that time, in the 1990s, there was not that much that Russia could have done about it. But when Vladimir Putin took over presidency, became the president of Russia in the 2000s, that's when the things started to change. He introduced a number of reforms, and Russia kind of started recovering, building its capacity, developing its military capabilities, and rethinking its doctrine, again, as kind of trying to become or present itself as one of the major powers in international relations. And so we had those kinds of different moments, like there was the Orange Revolution in 2004 in Ukraine, when there were forged elections in Ukraine, and there was a lot of kind of backlash from the West about the elections. But Russia was not so keen to actually see that those kind of elections are fair. It had a stake in those elections. Then in 2008, the war in Georgia broke out again. That further contributed to the kind of deterioration of relations between Europe and Russia. But the main controversy and the main problem emerged in 2014. Ukraine is a country which kind of borders Russia. It's a kind of Eastern European country, an important Eastern European country. In 2014, we have a civil war which essentially broke out in Ukraine. And the background to that civil war is that Ukraine was becoming closely associated with the European Union. The European Union was negotiating the so-called association agreement with Ukraine, and Ukraine was about to sign that agreement in the late 2013. It never did, because Russia started blackmailing Ukraine and essentially demanding that it doesn't sign that kind of agreement, because that would move Ukraine further towards the West and create economic links with the EU, which Russia didn't want to see, because Russia argued that it would severely hamper kind of relationship that Ukraine had with Russia, including all the economic ties. And so in the end, Ukraine didn't sign that agreement, but that led to protests, and those protests broke out in the late 2013 and early 2014, and those protests in turn led to violence and the violent response from the government. Eventually what happened was that part of Ukraine, Crimea, voted to leave Ukraine, and it joined the Russian Federation. So Crimea became part of Russia, a kind of transition, a move that was never recognized by Western capitals. But that's what happened. And then there was this protracted conflict in Ukraine, in southern, eastern parts of Ukraine. We can call it cold peace, right? So the problem, the situation is not completely resolved, but there are significant parts of the Ukrainian population which speak Russian, which are very much pro-Russian, which kind of feel this belonging to Russia and Russian identity, and those people feel very differently from the western part of Ukraine. And Russia got involved in that conflict. Vladimir Putin admitted that Russia had its troops on the ground in Ukraine, and so that was the kind of the final blow to the relations with the West. So since then, we talk about the new Cold War. The relations between Europe and Russia are at the historic low. Perhaps they are even worse than they were in the 1980s between Ronald Reagan and Mikhail Gorbachev. That's where we are. Now, the question is, what to do about that? What's the way forward? I mean, Russia is going to stay there. Russia is not going anywhere. It's going to be a country which is partially in Europe. So the question is there a way to accommodate Russia and to develop some kind of mutual understanding so that Europe and Russia and NATO and the European Union can coexist, and security of Europe is not threatened. So one response kind of to that question is the initiative that was undertaken by the European Union in 2016. The EU delegation to Russia. The European Union is an organization which has delegations in different countries. So there is EU delegation to Russia. In cooperation with Russian International Affairs Council, established the EU-Russia Experts Network on Foreign Policy. Right? So there is a platform now that was established in 2016 where I think 20 EU foreign policy experts and 20 Russian foreign policy experts meet regularly and have discussions about problems, about issues, how they see the world, and how they see the interests. So that's the kind of platform when they have those discussions, and this is quite important because the official diplomatic relations with Russia have been kind of have almost ceased to exist, right? They are not happening, right? So Russia would normally kind of work with NATO, cooperate and participate in some NATO meetings. So that's almost has kind of stopped. And so now there is this platform on EU-Russia Experts Network on Foreign Policy. Now, three kind of brief comments I will make about that platform, right? So that's the kind of final part of my short presentation today. For you, I want to share my three kind of thoughts on that platform and what it is and what it does. So the first one is on method, and that's something we talk about quite a lot in the module European Security Governance that I teach. And this network kind of represents the kind of quintessential European Union approach to international security. And you actually may be surprised that the European Union deals with international security. Perhaps that's the first time you hear about that, because it's not like the United States or the UK sending troops to Afghanistan or Iraq, right? The EU doesn't do that. But if we kind of broaden how we understand security, and there are different ways we can understand security, and that's again something we talk a lot about in that module that I mentioned, then you can see kind of the merits, and you can see how the EU is actually involved in the questions of security. So what I mean here is that this network that the EU helped to establish is quintessentially EU approach, because whenever there is a problem, the European Union tries to create an expert network and bring people together. And the reason why this is interesting is that if we think about the European Union as an international bureaucracy, and that's how it's often conceptualized in the literature on international relations, this kind of idea of international bureaucracy, that's how those bureaucracies approach problems. They try to depoliticize them. Depoliticize means kind of removing those kind of difficult political aspects of them and try to present them as technical, as something that can be solved by experts. Of course, in this case, the problem of EU-Russia relations cannot be depoliticized entirely. But at least the idea is to build trust and to seek kind of shared solutions, right? So that's how international bureaucracies approach international security problems, rather than sending diplomats and sending troops and humanitarian interventions, and rather than kind of trying to impose sanctions straight away. International bureaucracies try to create networks and platforms to meet, to discuss, to look for shared solutions and to build trust. The other aspect of that, I'll skip the second one because that's a little bit more advanced and theoretical. You would need more context for that one. So again, if you come to Southampton, we'll talk about that. But the third aspect that I want to talk about here is on the outcomes of that group and the kind of possible scenarios that it drew recently this year, between February and September this year, 2020. The group came up with 4 possible scenarios for the future of the EU-Russia cooperation. The first one is a cold partnership in a multipolar world where Russia and the EU ultimately return to extensive cooperation on issues such as climate change, digitalization and visa liberalization, while still facing major disagreements on European security. So cold partnership essentially means this kind of very pragmatic cooperation where the EU and Russia acknowledge that they have lots of disagreements, but they also agree on to cooperate on some things that are deemed kind of mutually important and where cooperation is less politically charged and in fact more technical, right? Less political and more technical. So that's the first possibility how European-Russian relations can evolve. Another possibility is a descent into anarchy as former European allies turn on each other in the wake of the devastating COVID-19 pandemic, backed variously by Russia, the United States, and China. So in that scenario, Europe would kind of disintegrate into individual countries with individual interests, and those countries would be backed in on the kind of individual basis by China, Russia, or the United States. And we could see a little bit of that in this year, where Russia would kind of highly publicize its assistance to Italy, for example. It would send kind of military medical assistance to Italy to help it cope with the pandemic. We could see that with China getting involved in some countries like Italy, but also some Eastern European countries, providing kind of assistance to those countries, not always of highest quality, and then kind of highly publicizing it and making a big kind of diplomatic deal out of this. So that's the kind of situation where some countries in Europe could actually see more value cooperating with countries like China than with the European Union, right, for example. So that would be the kind of descent into anarchy if that kind of is taken to its extreme. Europe on the brink of war is the third scenario, as a reunited and rejuvenated West approaches military confrontation with a sluggish Russia. So in that scenario, Europe kind of reunifies, becomes unified, coherent, strong, speaking with one voice, and confronts Russia in a sense and says, you need to do this or you need to do that, and tries to extend NATO membership to Ukraine. That was perhaps from the Russian perspective, that as the Russian expert kind of told me at this recent roundtable discussion that we had, from the Russian perspective, it was the prospect of Ukrainian membership in NATO, which was the main problem for Russia and the reason for this kind of for action in 2014. So that was the main issue. Russia, that was the red line. Russia didn't want to see Ukraine joining NATO. So in that kind of scenario, this kind of confrontation would be much more likely with Russia. And the fourth and the kind of most optimistic scenario is a community of values uniting a transformed Russia and a strong EU in an international environment characterized by progress on conflict resolution in the neighborhood and resurgent multilateralism. So multilateralism is this phrase that I already mentioned. It essentially means an approach to international relations which strives to be cooperative and which strives to get as many kind of countries and stakeholders on board as possible, so that when a state leader communicates that they are committed to multilateralism, they will typically want to be very active within international organizations. So Donald Trump, for example, is an example of someone who is the opposite of that, right? He has been arguing that the United States should not commit itself to international organizations. He withdrew support to the World Health Organization, and he withdrew from some multilateral agreements. So that's the opposite of multilateralism. So in that scenario, both Europe and Russia would actually rediscover the value of multilateralism, and they would find ways to cooperate on the kind of questions of Eastern Europe and neighborhood, and they would not see Ukraine, for example, as a zero-sum game. Zero-sum game this term comes from the game theory, where we have this perception that when one party wins, the other one loses exactly the same amount. So there is always winners and losers, essentially. So there is this kind of perception that this is the case right now, but there is also hope that this winner and losers, this kind of zero-sum game, can be overcome. And in that scenario, the optimistic scenario, it is overcome. Countries find ways to cooperate and to develop kind of deals and relationships without kind of making other party like that they lose. So that's essentially the kind of overview of Europe-Russia relations with some reflections. Again, this is what we talk about in European security governance, and hopefully I will be able to kind of get you involved in those discussions too. I find them very fascinating. We can then do it with the proper background, theoretical, methodological, empirical. We can kind of have proper debates. But that's it from me for now, and I hope to see you at Southampton.